She was forced to do laundry in ice-cold water, while her cousins relaxed in heated rooms. Li Sui Sui's life as an orphan in Qingshui village was nothing short of torturous, with relatives who saw her as nothing more than free labor and a potential paycheck. But one rainy afternoon, a simple act of kindness toward an elderly woman collapsing on the roadside would transform her from household servant to the daughter of one of the most powerful families in the country. How could saving a stranger's life completely rewrite her destiny? Stay with me to witness the moment everything changed for this mistreated orphan girl. Li Sui once knew what it meant to be loved. Before the landslide that changed everything, her childhood in Qingshui village had been simple but warm. She remembered her father's calloused hands gently braiding her hair each morning before school, and her mother's soft humming as she prepared their modest meals in their small but tidy home. Those memories now felt like fragments from someone else's life, precious butterflies she could only observe from afar, never touch again. The villagers still spoke of that terrible night when the mountain gave way after weeks of relentless rain. Sui Sui had been staying with a school friend when mud and rock devoured half the village, including her family's home. At 10 years old, she stood among the survivors as they pulled bodies from the wreckage, her small frame shaking not from the cold rain, but from a grief too vast for her young mind to process. Her parents were among the 23 who never made it out alive. Within days, her mother's older brother and his wife arrived from the neighboring township. They stood rigid at the memorial, their expressions more inconvenienced than grieved, as they accepted condolences for a sister they had rarely visited. "We'll take care of her now," her uncle announced to the village elders, one hand heavy on Sui Sui's shoulder. "She's family, after all." The words sounded rehearsed, empty of the emotion that should accompany such a promise. The journey to her new home took less than 2 hours, but it might as well have been a voyage to another world. Her aunt showed her to a narrow storage room behind the kitchen, hastily cleared of preserved vegetables and farming tools. "You'll sleep here," she said, dropping Sui Sui's small bag of belongings onto a thin mat on the floor. "We start early tomorrow. I expect you to earn your keep." Those first weeks, Sui Sui tried desperately to be grateful. Compared to having no home at all, surely this was better. Her aunt taught her to cook the family meals, standing over her as she struggled to manage the heavy walk. When she spilled a pot of rice, her uncle made her go without dinner. "Resources aren't unlimited," he lectured, as her 3 cousins watched her clean the mess, their bowls full. "You need to learn the value of what you're given." By the time winter arrived, any pretense of familial affection had vanished like morning frost under harsh sun. Sui Sui rose before dawn each day, lighting the fires and preparing breakfast before anyone else stirred. Her hands, once soft and small, grew rough with chilblains from washing clothes in the icy stream behind the house. While her cousins complained about homework, she longed for the education that was gradually slipping away from her. "School is an indulgence," her aunt declared, after the 2nd month, when Sui Sui asked about returning to classes. "We can barely afford to send our own children. You need practical skills more than book learning." The village school was free, but the uniform and books were not, a conveniently legitimate excuse to keep her laboring at home instead. The contrast between Sui Sui's existence and that of her cousins grew starker with each passing season. While she slept on her thin mat in the unheated storage room, they shared proper beds with quilts and rooms with electric heaters. As she served them dinner, they complained about the quality of their new shoes or squabbled over whose turn it was to use the family's tablet. Sui Sui wore their cast-offs, clothes always slightly too big or too small, shoes that pinched or slipped off her feet. What hurt most wasn't the physical discomfort, but the casual cruelty. Her youngest cousin, a girl just 2 years her junior, developed a habit of spilling things deliberately when Sui Sui had just finished cleaning. "Clumsy orphan," she would say with mock sympathy, as Sui Sui silently wiped up the mess. Her oldest cousin, a boy of 15, watched her with uncomfortable intensity when she bathed at the outdoor pump, making comments about how she was filling out that left her feeling exposed and vulnerable. Yet somehow, in this hostile environment, Sui Sui's spirit refused to break completely. She found small mercies in unexpected places. The elderly neighbor who sometimes slipped her a sweet when no one was looking. The stray dog she fed scraps that would wait for her by the woodpile. The tattered book of folk tales she'd salvaged from her parents' belongings that she read by moonlight when everyone was asleep. In these quiet moments of stolen peace, Sui Sui cultivated something her relatives couldn't touch, an inner resolve that hardened like steel with each indignity she endured. She learned to move through their home like a ghost, anticipating needs before they were voiced, becoming invisible when tensions rose. This wasn't submission, but survival, a calculated patience that allowed her to preserve some essential part of herself they couldn't claim. She overheard her uncle one evening, talking to her aunt over rice wine after the children had gone to bed. "The Jang boy is looking for a wife," he said, his words slightly slurred. "His father approached me today." "That old widower?" her aunt replied. "He must be 40 at least." 45, her uncle corrected with a laugh. "But the family has money from their business in the city. They're offering 200,000 for a young bride. They don't care about education or family connections. Just want someone young and healthy, who can work hard, and give them grandsons." The silence that followed made Sui Sui's blood run cold as she stood frozen behind the thin wall, a stack of mended clothes in her arms. "She's only 16, her aunt finally said, but there was calculation rather than concern in her voice. "We could ask for more because of her age. 200,000 would be enough to buy that new truck and still have money to expand the shop," her uncle mused. "And it's not like she's really our daughter. We've fed and housed her for 6 years. It's time she repaid that debt." That night, as moonlight filtered through the small window of her storage room, Sui Sui wept silently for the first time since the landslide. The truth was now undeniable. She wasn't family to these people. She was inventory, an investment they'd maintained until it could yield a profitable return. The revelation should have destroyed her, but instead, it crystallized something within her. If she was nothing but property to them, then she owed them nothing in return. 3 days later, her uncle made the announcement over dinner, presenting it as if he'd secured her a prize. "It's settled," he declared, not meeting her eyes. "You'll marry Zhang Liang next month. His father has agreed to the bride price, and we'll use part of it to buy you proper wedding clothes." He attempted a jovial tone. "You should be grateful. Many girls don't have such opportunities. You'll have security and position as his wife." Sui Sui's cousins stared at her with a mixture of shock and vindictive satisfaction. Her youngest cousin smirked. "Better her than me," she muttered to her sister. "I heard his last wife died in childbirth. The one before ran away." "You'll live in their family compound," her aunt added, as if this were a selling point. "It's much larger than our home. They even have indoor plumbing and a television in every room." Sui Sui looked down at her bowl, her face carefully blank, as she had trained it to be for years. "When will I meet him?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the terror clawing at her throat. "There's no need for that," her uncle dismissed. "The contract is signed. He'll see you at the wedding." He reached for more food. The matter closed in his mind. Behind Sui Sui's carefully blank expression that evening lay 6 years of systematic dehumanization that had prepared her for this moment. The arranged marriage wasn't a sudden betrayal, but the inevitable conclusion to a childhood where she'd been methodically stripped of dignity and opportunity while sleeping mere walls away from a family that saw her as nothing but an investment, finally ready to mature. Each morning began the same way, with darkness. While the village remained silent and her relatives enjoyed the comfort of warm beds, Sui Sui would rise at 4:30 a.m., her body trained to wake without an alarm. The first task was always lighting the cooking fire, her fingers clumsy with cold, as she arranged kindling and blew gently until flames caught. By 5, she would be hauling water from the communal well, making 3 trips with buckets that left deep red marks on her palms, permanent calluses forming by the time she turned 12. Winter mornings were particularly brutal. The washing needed to be done regardless of temperature, and Sui Sui would kneel beside the basin outdoors, breaking through a thin layer of ice before plunging her hands into water so cold it burned. Her skin would crack and bleed, reopening wounds that never fully healed from November through March. No one offered her gloves. Those were reserved for her cousin's delicate hands when they ventured outside to play. The physical evidence of her servitude marked her body like a map of her suffering. Burns from oil splatter decorated her forearms, where she'd learned to shield the food rather than herself when cooking mishaps occurred. Her back ached constantly from carrying loads of firewood and produce up the hill from the market, developing an almost permanent curve by her early teens from tasks meant for adults with fully formed bodies. Perhaps more devastating than the physical toll was the calculated dismantling of her future through education denial. Initially, her uncle had permitted her attendance at the village school, presenting himself as magnanimous to neighbors while she sat in the back row in faded clothes. But by 12, the excuses began. School costs too much for someone who'll just cook and clean her whole life, her aunt would say within Sui's hearing, though they all knew the basic education was provided free by the government. What they wouldn't provide were the small necessities: pencils, proper shoes, the occasional new textbook. Meanwhile, her cousins received private tutoring in mathematics and English, electronic learning devices appearing in their rooms, while Sui was told that even paper was too expensive for someone of her station. The contrast between resources dedicated to blood relations versus those allocated to Sui formed a clear message about her worth. Her cousins wore new clothes for each season, while she received their cast-offs only after they'd been worn to near uselessness. When winter came, they slept under electric blankets, while her storage room remained unheated, forcing her to layer every garment she owned just to sleep without shivering. Mealtimes crystallized her position most clearly. After preparing elaborate dishes under her aunt's critical eye, Sui would serve the family, standing silently behind them as they ate. Only after they finished would she be permitted to collect whatever remained, often just rice, with perhaps a small portion of vegetables. Meat having disappeared entirely from the serving platters before her turn came. "Don't waste good protein on someone who doesn't need to grow a brain," her uncle once remarked, when a cousin questioned why Sui never received fish like the rest of them. The family laughed, while Sui maintained her carefully neutral expression, having learned early that showing hurt only invited further cruelty. When illness struck, the inequality became dangerously apparent. During a particularly harsh winter, Sui developed a fever that left her trembling and incoherent, yet was still expected to perform her chores. While her youngest cousin received immediate medical attention for a minor cough, Sui was given only cold water and told to sweat it out in her unheated room. She survived by sheer determination, wrapping herself in damp rags to bring down the fever that no one bothered to help treat. Public humiliation became routine, particularly from her cousins who had been raised to see her as subhuman. They would intentionally create messes for her to clean, knock over water she just carried, or hide items and accuse her of stealing them. When guests visited, they would loudly remark on her clumsiness or stupidity, performing their superiority for appreciative adult audiences who reinforce the dynamic with approving smiles. One autumn morning, when Sui had accidentally broken a teacup while washing dishes, her aunt made her kneel on uncooked rice in the courtyard for 3 hours, visible to any villager passing by. The physical pain paled compared to the shame of public punishment, her status as less than family displayed for all to witness. Yet in the crucible of this treatment, something unexpected formed within Sui. Not hatred, but an unbreakable core of selfhood they couldn't reach. She developed subtle mechanisms of survival that preserved her humanity when everything around her conspired to erase it. Dawn became her sacred time. Rising earlier than required, she would steal 10 precious minutes to watch the sun crest the hills before anyone could demand her labor. In these moments, surrounded by dew-laden fields and distant birdsong, she would whisper her real name to herself, a reminder that she existed beyond her usefulness to others. She found small mercies in unexpected places. The stray village cat that others shooed away received scraps from her own meager portions, the animal's trust and affection becoming a rare source of unconditional warmth. When collecting wood in the forest, she would gather wildflowers that no one would miss, pressing them between the pages of discarded newspapers to create a hidden collection of beauty beneath her sleeping mat. Most importantly, Sui Sui preserved her capacity for compassion. When her youngest cousin fell into the irrigation ditch, it was Sui Sui who pulled her out, despite knowing the child had deliberately tripped her the day before. When her uncle fell ill with influenza, she prepared special medicinal soups remembered from her mother's teachings, though he had never shown her similar care. This preserved humanity manifested in quiet rebellions. She would discreetly help elderly neighbors with their chores when sent to the market, extending kindness she was never shown. She carefully maintained memories of her parents through private rituals, tracing their names in spilled rice flour before sweeping it away, or humming her mother's lullabies under her breath while working alone. Her sense of justice remained intact, not through loud defiance, which would have been swiftly punished, but through an internal refusal to accept the narrative of her worthlessness. She recognized the injustice of her situation without allowing it to define her self-perception, a psychological feat of remarkable resilience for someone so young and isolated. Even as her relatives systematically restricted her options and dignity, Sui Sui cultivated patience. She observed the world carefully, gathering information others didn't realize she was processing. She listened to conversations about business and money while appearing oblivious, developing an understanding of value and exchange that would later prove invaluable. She watched how power operated in village relationships, learning lessons her cousins, cushioned by privilege, never needed to learn. That night, Sui Sui's world collapsed with terrible clarity. All her observations about value and exchange crystallized into one horrifying truth as she stood frozen outside the kitchen door, listening to her uncle's voice haggle over her future. For years, she had been property in all but name. Now, she was literally being priced for sale. 200,000 is more than fair, her uncle insisted to the man whose breathing sounded labored through the thin wall. She's young, healthy, and knows how to maintain a household properly. No bad habits or rebellious tendencies. The stranger's voice was gravelly when he replied, "My son deserves a proper wife from a respectable family. This girl, she's just an orphan you took in from charity." Sui Sui pressed her palm against her mouth to stifle any sound as her uncle laughed, a sound she rarely heard except when money was involved. That makes her more valuable. No demanding parents to interfere. No family connections to cause problems. She'll be completely dependent on your household. The bargaining continued for another hour, while Sui Sui remained motionless, her legs cramping, but fear keeping her rooted to the spot. This wasn't just about another household to serve. The whispered rumors about Zhang Liang's family had reached even her carefully restricted ears. The last girl who had married into their household had vanished within a year, and the one before her had reportedly fallen ill and died before bearing children. Yet no one questioned these disappearances because of the Zhang family's connections to officials who could make problems disappear. When the front door finally closed and her uncle returned to the kitchen where her aunt waited, Sui Sui crept closer to hear their private conversation. "He's agreed to the full amount," her uncle announced triumphantly. "Half before the wedding, half after she produces a child." Her aunt clicked her tongue against her teeth. "Did you see his rings? That family could afford twice that amount. You should have asked for more. Don't be greedy. This is already a windfall." Her uncle's voice softened into something almost resembling affection. "We've fed and housed her for 6 years. Now she'll finally repay our generosity." "She'd better not cause problems," her aunt muttered. "I'll start preparing her tomorrow. That old man will expect certain things, and she needs to understand her duties if we want the second payment." The casual cruelty of their planning sent chills through Sui Sui's body. She had always known they viewed her as an investment rather than family, but hearing them discuss the intimate details of her marriage duties with such cold calculation made her physically ill. She barely made it outside before emptying her stomach behind the woodpile. The following days brought a new kind of horror. Her aunt began what she called wife training, instructions delivered in clinical detail about how to please her future husband, interspersed with warnings about the consequences of failure. "If he sends you back, you'll have nowhere to go," her aunt reminded her daily. "No one wants a rejected bride. and we certainly won't take you back after embarrassing us. Sui Sui's few possessions were gathered and assessed for their appropriateness in her new life. Most were deemed worthless. Her aunt presented her with a single new dress for the wedding day, the only new clothing she had received in 6 years. But even this gesture was tainted with calculation. The Zhang family expects their daughter-in-law to look presentable, her aunt explained, while measuring her for alterations. This fabric was expensive, so don't gain weight before the wedding. One evening, desperate and terrified, Sui Sui approached her uncle while he calculated the day's profits from their small shop. "Uncle," she began, her voice barely audible, "please don't make me marry into the Zhang family." Her uncle didn't look up from his ledger. "This isn't a discussion, Sui Sui. The arrangements have been made." But the rumors about what happened to their previous daughters-in-law, his hand slammed down on the table, sending coins scattering. "Ignorant village gossip. You should be grateful someone of their standing would accept you. Do you think you deserve better? After all we've done for you, I could work harder here," she pleaded. "I could find additional work in the village to contribute more." "Enough." His voice cut through the air like a whip. "This isn't about what you want. This is about family obligation. We took you in when no one else would. Now it's time you repaid that debt." Her aunt, overhearing from the doorway, added her own warning. "If you try to run away or embarrass us, your uncle has already spoken with the village council. They'll help bring you back, by force if necessary." The tight smile that followed chilled Sui Sui more than any shouting could have. "Besides, where would you go? Who would help you? You have no one." That night, alone in her storage room, Sui Sui confronted the stark reality of her situation. Her relatives had systematically isolated her from anyone who might have helped her. The few villagers who had shown her kindness were either too poor or too afraid of her uncle's connections to intervene. The school teachers who had once praised her intelligence had long ago stopped asking why she no longer attended classes. She was trapped in a system that viewed young women as commodities to be traded for financial gain, with no recourse to justice or compassion. The knowledge that she had been assigned a specific monetary value, $200,000, payable in installments like a household appliance, created a peculiar kind of psychological torture. Her humanity had been calculated, assessed, and found to be worth exactly the price of a new truck and business expansion. The wedding date was set for just 2 weeks away. Sui Sui watched the calendar with growing terror, each passing day bringing her closer to what she had come to view as a death sentence. She began hiding small amounts of food, gathering what meager possessions might help her survive, and mapping possible escape routes from the village. But every plan she considered seemed destined to fail. She had no money, no identification documents, and nowhere to go. 3 days before the wedding, her aunt presented her with the completed wedding dress, its red fabric garish against Sui Sui's pale skin. "Remember everything I've taught you," her aunt instructed while making final adjustments. "The Zhang family has agreed to send the first payment tomorrow. Don't give them any reason to reconsider." That night, Sui Sui lay awake, planning her final, desperate attempt at escape. She would leave before dawn, taking only what she could carry, and try to reach the next village before anyone noticed her absence. From there, perhaps she could find work, any work, that would allow her to survive independently. The chances of success were minimal, but the alternative had become unbearable. Better to die trying to escape than to be delivered like livestock to a man who treats wives as disposable, she whispered to herself in the darkness, clutching the small bundle she had prepared. She would leave at first light, using the cover of her usual morning chores to slip away unnoticed. As the first rays of morning light filtered through the mist, Sui Sui set out along the rural path with determined steps. Freedom tasted like morning dew as she fled down the dirt road, her heart pounding with equal measures of terror and hope. The small bundle of her possessions felt heavy against her side, but not as heavy as the knowledge that every step took her further from a life of servitude and closer to an uncertain future. The village still slumbered behind her, unaware that one of its daughters had chosen escape over submission. The weight of her decision pressed against her chest with each labored breath. 2 miles from the village, Sui Sui paused to adjust her bundle and wipe the perspiration from her brow. The morning was still cool, but anxiety and exertion had dampened her threadbare clothes. In that moment of brief respite, fate intervened with the subtlety of a whisper. An elegant elderly woman appeared around the bend in the road, her posture regal, despite her advanced years. Her clothing alone would have marked her as someone from another world. Fine silk, in deep blue, that caught the morning light and shimmered like water. Before Sui Sui could decide whether to hide or continue forward, the woman's composure shattered. She clutched suddenly at her chest, her face contorting in pain as she stumbled and began to collapse to the ground. The universe has a peculiar way of testing those already at their breaking point. In that critical moment, Sui Sui faced an impossible choice: continue her desperate escape when every second meant increasing her lead, or stop to help a stranger when her own future hung by the thinnest thread. For most, the calculation would have been simple: self-preservation above all. But despite years of mistreatment, something fundamental remained unbroken within her. Without hesitation, Sui Sui dropped her precious bundle and rushed to the woman's side. Her hands, calloused from years of labor, moved with surprising gentleness as she eased the elderly woman to the ground. The woman's eyes, clouded with pain, fixed briefly on Sui Sui's face before fluttering closed. Her breathing came in short, labored gasps. "Please, stay with me," Sui Sui whispered, her mind racing through fragments of medical knowledge gleaned from a faded first aid poster she had studied during her brief schooling. The symptoms aligned with what she remembered about heart attacks: the clutching at the chest, the difficult breathing, the sudden collapse. With careful movements, Sui Sui loosened the woman's collar and positioned her more comfortably on the ground. She placed her bundle beneath the woman's head and checked to ensure her airway remained clear. Each action was performed with a focused calm that belied the panic threatening to overwhelm her. Every moment spent here was a moment closer to discovery, to being dragged back to a wedding she dreaded more than death itself. Yet she continued, speaking softly to the unconscious woman, offering reassurance even as her own future slipped away. The distant sound of an approaching vehicle sent a jolt of fear through Sui Sui. Discovery meant return, and return meant a life worse than the one she'd endured for 6 years. For a heartbeat, the urge to flee nearly overwhelmed her, but the woman's labored breathing held her in place as firmly as chains. Around the bend came not the farm truck she feared, but a sleek black car that seemed otherworldly on the rural road. It came to an abrupt halt, and 2 well-dressed men exploded from the vehicle with expressions of horror. "Madame Lin!" the first man cried out, rushing toward them. His eyes darted between the elegant woman on the ground and the shabby girl kneeling beside her. "What happened? What did you do?" "She collapsed," Sui Sui explained, her voice steady despite the accusation. "I think her heart. She was clutching her chest before she fell." The second man was already making a call on a phone that cost more than Sui Sui had seen in her entire life. "Medical emergency on the rural access road, approximately 2 kilometers from Qingshui village," he said with clipped precision. "Madame Lin appears to have suffered a cardiac event. A local girl is providing assistance." The first man knelt opposite Sui Sui, his initial suspicion giving way to desperate gratitude as he assessed the situation. "You stayed with her," he said, not quite a question. "You helped her." Before Sui Sui could respond, the elderly woman's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, confusion clouded her gaze, then awareness returned with startling clarity. Her focus immediately fixed on Sui's face. "You," she whispered, her voice weak but imperious, even in distress. "You helped me." Anyone would have, Sui Sui replied, though they both knew this wasn't true. Many would have walked past, unwilling to involve themselves in a stranger's crisis. A hint of a smile touched the woman's lips. "No," she contradicted softly. "Not anyone." Within minutes, the quiet rural road transformed into a scene of controlled chaos. Another vehicle arrived, this one clearly medical in nature. Professionals in uniforms replaced Sui Sui at the woman's side, their equipment and expertise making her simple aid seem woefully inadequate. Yet the elderly woman's hand reached out, surprisingly strong, and grasped Sui Sui's wrist as they prepared to move her. "Your name?" she demanded, her gaze intense, despite her condition. "Li Sui Sui," she answered, aware of how plain and rural her name must sound to this woman of obvious wealth and refinement. Li Sui Sui, the woman repeated, as if committing it to memory. You will come with me. The statement, delivered with such calm authority, left no room for refusal. Yet Sui Sui hesitated, torn between the opportunity to put more distance between herself and her uncle's home and the strange magnetic pull of this unexpected encounter. I can't, she began, gesturing vaguely back toward the village. I have to. Whatever awaits you, there can wait, the woman interrupted, her perception uncanny. I insist. The staff exchanged glances, clearly accustomed to obeying this woman's commands without question. One of them stepped forward. Madame Lin must get to the hospital immediately. If she wishes you to accompany her, we will make arrangements. Sui Sui looked down at her simple clothes, stained with dirt from the road, and the woman's expensive silk. She looked back toward the direction of her escape route, then to her bundle still lying on the ground where it had served as a pillow. Everything she owned in the world fit into that small package, and even that she had been prepared to abandon to help a stranger. My things, she began, will be brought, the first man assured her, already retrieving her bundle with more care than anyone had shown her possessions in years. As they helped Madame Lin into the vehicle, Sui Sui found herself guided into the back seat beside the elderly woman. The interior of the car was another world. Soft leather, cool air that seemed to come from nowhere, and a hushed quality that muffled the outside world. Madame Lin's hand remained on her wrist, the touch light, but somehow binding. You saved my life, she stated with absolute certainty as the car pulled away. Now I find myself curious about the girl who would stop to help a stranger when she herself was clearly running away. Sui Sui's eyes widened. How did you... The bundle, the early hour, the look in your eyes. Madame Lin's gaze was penetrating despite her physical distress. I recognize desperation when I see it, child. The question is, what drives a young girl to flee down a rural road alone? Madame Lin's question hung in the air between them as the sleek car glided toward a future neither woman could have predicted hours earlier. What would you do if a complete stranger offered to completely transform your life after a single, instinctive act of kindness? For Sui Sui, that impossible scenario was about to become her new reality. The hospital corridor gleamed with polished floors and antiseptic efficiency that made Sui Sui acutely aware of her rough hands and simple clothing. Nurses in pristine uniforms and doctors with confident strides moved past her as if she were invisible, reinforcing her sense of displacement. She perched uncomfortably on the edge of a plush waiting room chair, feeling as though the dirt from her shoes might somehow contaminate the spotless environment. The waiting area alone was larger than the entire main room of her uncle's house, with digital screens displaying information she couldn't fully comprehend. Hours passed. As Sui Sui waited, her thoughts torn between concern for the elderly woman and mounting anxiety about her absence from home. Each minute she remained away increased the likelihood of severe punishment upon her return. A nurse occasionally glanced her way with a mixture of curiosity and pity, but no one offered information until a doctor in an expensive-looking suit approached her directly. "You're the young lady who assisted Madame Lin?" he asked, his tone suggesting he found it difficult to believe someone of her appearance could have been helpful. When Sui Sui nodded, his expression shifted slightly. "Her condition has stabilized. You likely saved her life with your quick response. Do you understand who she is?" Sui Sui shook her head, confusion evident on her face. The doctor's eyebrows rose. Madame Lin is the matriarch of Lin Enterprises. Her family controls significant portions of the country's technology, manufacturing, and real estate development. He paused, letting the information sink in. "She's asking to see you." Led through corridors that seemed to grow increasingly opulent, Sui Sui entered a private suite that resembled a luxury apartment, more than a hospital room. Madame Lin reclined against silken pillows, her face pale but alert, surrounded by medical equipment that hummed quietly in the background. Despite her medical ordeal, she maintained an air of dignified authority. "Leave us," Madame Lin instructed the medical staff with a subtle wave of her hand. As the door closed behind them, she studied Sui Sui with penetrating intensity. "Come closer, child. I wish to properly thank the person who saved my life." Sui Sui approached cautiously, her posture reflecting years of learned subservience. "I require no thanks, madam. Anyone would have done the same." A smile touched Madame Lin's lips. "We both know that isn't true. Many would have walked past, or simply called for help, and continued on their way. You stayed. You acted." She reached for a small lacquered box on her bedside table and removed a stack of cash that made Sui Sui's eyes widen. "This should adequately express my gratitude." The sum represented more money than Sui Sui had seen in her entire life, enough to potentially buy her freedom from the arranged marriage and establish some measure of independence. Her fingers trembled slightly as she considered the implications. But then, surprising both Madame Lin and herself, she shook her head. "I cannot accept payment for doing what any decent person should," Sui Sui said quietly, her gaze steady, despite her pounding heart. "Your recovery is sufficient reward." Madame Lin's expression transformed from surprise to genuine curiosity. "Interesting. In my experience, everyone has a price. Why would someone in your," she gestured at Sui Sui's worn clothing, "circumstances refuse financial assistance?" "Because helping you wasn't a transaction," Sui Sui replied simply. "It was the right thing to do." This answer seemed to intrigue Madame Lin even further. She set the money aside and leaned forward slightly. "Tell me about yourself, Li Sui Sui. Who are you returning to with such urgency?" "Family, waiting for you." The simple question unlocked a flood of information, as Sui Sui haltingly explained her circumstances, her orphaned status, the years of servitude, and finally, the impending marriage arranged without her consent. She spoke without self-pity or dramatization, presenting the facts of her life as though discussing the weather. Madame Lin listened in silence, her expression growing increasingly serious. When Sui Sui finished speaking, the older woman reached for a glass of water beside her bed, taking a measured sip before responding. "I've lived nearly 7 decades, Madame Lin said eventually. In that time, I've encountered countless individuals seeking to ingratiate themselves to me through flattery, favors, and false kindness. Yet here you stand, someone who helped me without knowledge of who I am, who refuses payment, and who demonstrates remarkable dignity, despite unconscionable treatment." She set the glass down with deliberate precision. "I find myself in an unusual position. I owe you a debt that money cannot repay." Sui Sui shifted uncomfortably. "You owe me nothing, madam." "On the contrary," Madame Lin replied, "I believe I was meant to cross your path today." She paused, studying Sui Sui with such intensity that the girl felt as though the woman could see into her very soul. "Instead of money, I would like to offer you something entirely different, something that would change the entire course of your life." Sui Sui's heart quickened. "I don't understand." "I'm proposing to legally adopt you," Madame Lin stated, with the same direct confidence she might use to announce a business acquisition. "You would become my legal daughter, under my protection and care. You would receive proper education, security, and opportunities you cannot currently imagine." The room seemed to spin around Sui Sui as she struggled to comprehend what she was hearing. This proposition was so far beyond anything she could have anticipated that her mind struggled to process it. "Why would you do such a thing for a stranger?" "Because I recognize something in you that is increasingly rare in this world," Madame Lin replied. "Integrity, without expectation of reward. Compassion, despite personal suffering. These qualities cannot be purchased or manufactured. They must be nurtured." She reached for a small bell beside her bed, ringing at once. "Additionally, I have no daughter of my own, only sons who are consumed by business affairs. Perhaps it's selfishness on my part, wanting someone of substance to share my remaining years." A legal assistant entered the room, carrying documents that Madame Lin had apparently requested during Sui Sui's absence. "I've taken the liberty of having preliminary adoption papers drawn up," she explained, noting Sui Sui's shocked expression. "In my position, efficiency is essential. However, the choice remains entirely yours." Sui Sui stared at the documents, her mind racing through the implications. Could this be real? Or some elaborate deception? Her life had taught her to be wary of offers that seemed too good to be true. Yet the authoritative presence of Madame Lin, the luxurious hospital suite, and the deferential behavior of the staff all suggested this woman truly possessed the power to transform her circumstances. "This is too much to comprehend," Sui Sui admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Madame Lin nodded with understanding. "Of course, such decisions shouldn't be made hastily." She motioned to the assistant, who placed the documents on a side table. "However, you mentioned your marriage is scheduled within days. Time is a luxury you don't currently possess." Time wasn't the only luxury Sui Sui had never possessed. But what happens when someone who has nothing suddenly gains the protection of someone who has everything? The sleepy dirt roads of Qingshui village had never witnessed the arrival of wealth and influence like what was about to descend upon them. Madame Lin had made her decision with the same decisive authority that had built her business empire. She would personally accompany Sui Sui back to her village to formalize the adoption and retrieve whatever meager belongings the girl wished to take from her former life. "We'll leave immediately," Madame Lin announced, her tone leaving no room for discussion as she instructed her driver to prepare for the journey. "My legal team will meet us there with the necessary paperwork." Sui Sui sat frozen, barely able to process this sudden turn of events. Just hours ago, she had been preparing for a life of servitude as a child bride. Now, she was riding in a vehicle worth more than every structure in her village combined, accompanied by one of the most powerful women in the country. The convoy of 3 black luxury vehicles created an immediate stir as they entered Qingshui village. Children stopped their games to stare, women paused their washing, and men halted their conversations. The procession of gleaming cars moved slowly through the narrow dirt paths, kicking up dust that seemed to hang in the air, like a physical manifestation of the village's collective shock. When the vehicles finally came to a stop, outside Sui Sui's uncle's modest dwelling, a small crowd had already begun to gather. Sui Sui felt her chest tighten as she stepped out of the car, the familiar sense of shame and inadequacy washing over her, despite her new circumstances. The contrast between Madame Lin, emerging elegantly from the vehicle in her fine clothes, and the poverty surrounding them could not have been more stark. Her uncle emerged from the house, his face a mask of confusion that quickly transformed into calculation as he took in the expensive cars and well-dressed strangers. His eyes narrowed when he spotted Sui Sui, an initial flash of anger quickly replaced by something more cunning. "Niece," he called out with forced warmth that Sui Sui had never heard directed at her before. "We've been so worried. Where have you been?" Before Sui Sui could respond, her aunt appeared in the doorway, letting out an exaggerated cry of relief that rang false to everyone present. "Our precious girl has returned. We've been sick with worry." Madame Lin observed this performance with shrewd eyes, taking note of how Sui Sui instinctively tensed at their approach. The older woman's gaze swept over the property, registering the uneven distribution of resources. The new additions to the main house, contrasting sharply with the dilapidated storage structure, where she could now see a thin mat rolled in the corner. "Mrs. Lin," Sui Sui's uncle said, bowing slightly as he addressed the elegant stranger, "we're so grateful you've brought our niece home safely. She's very important to us." "I'm sure she is," Madame Lin replied coolly, "particularly given the bride price you've negotiated for her." The uncle's face faltered momentarily before he recovered. "There seems to be a misunderstanding. We only want what's best for Sui Sui. She's like a daughter to us." The aunt nodded vigorously. "We've given her everything we could afford. Times have been so difficult for everyone in the village." Madame Lin's expression remained impassive as she gestured toward her assistant, who stepped forward with a leather portfolio. "I am here to formalize the adoption of Li Sui Sui into my family. My legal team has prepared all the necessary documentation." The word adoption hit the gathering crowd like a thunderclap, sending a wave of whispers through the onlookers. Sui Sui's uncle's face hardened, the facade of affection crumbling. "That's impossible," he stated flatly. "She's already promised in marriage. The ceremony is in 3 days. We've received a non-refundable deposit." "I'm prepared to compensate you for any financial commitments," Madame Lin replied, her voice maintaining its composed tone even as her eyes turned steely. "Whatever the Jiang family has offered, I will double." The crowd's murmuring grew louder, and Sui Sui noticed several villagers exchanging looks of disbelief. Her cousins had pushed their way to the front, their expressions a mixture of shock and resentment. "It's not that simple," her uncle insisted, his voice dropping. "Agreements have been made. My reputation in this community—" "Your reputation?" Madame Lin interrupted, her voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear. "I wonder what your reputation would be if the authorities were to investigate the conditions under which you've kept your orphaned niece, or if the Labor Bureau examined how a child has been working from dawn until night without compensation or education." The uncle's face paled visibly. "You don't understand our customs here." "I understand perfectly," Madame Lin cut in. "I understand exploitation when I see it, and I understand the law." She turned slightly, addressing her assistant. "Please inform Mr. Jiang that his deposit will be returned in full, with interest, and that his arrangement with this family is now void." The uncle's resistance crumbled further as Madame Lin's identity became clear to him through whispers from the crowd. One couldn't build an empire like Lin Enterprises without developing connections that extended into every corner of influence, connections that could make life very difficult for a rural shopkeeper with questionable business practices. "The girl has nothing," the aunt interjected, trying a different approach. "No education, no skills. What could someone like you possibly want with her?" Madame Lin turned her gaze directly to the woman, her voice low but clear. "She has something far more valuable than anything you've taught her. She has humanity and compassion that survived despite your best efforts to crush it." The legal team worked efficiently, processing the formal dissolution of Sui Sui's ties to her relatives. The documents were signed under the watchful eyes of the entire village, many of whom had witnessed years of Sui Sui's mistreatment but had never intervened. Now they watched with a mixture of awe and discomfort as power and wealth rewrote the story they thought they knew. When asked if there was anything she wished to take with her, Sui Sui hesitated before shaking her head. "There's nothing here that belongs to me," she said quietly. As the paperwork concluded, Madame Lin placed a protective hand on Sui Sui's shoulder. "You are under my protection now," she stated firmly, her words directed not just at Sui Sui's relatives, but at the entire gathering. "Any attempts to contact her without her consent will be met with legal consequences." The transformation was complete. The girl who had arrived in the village as a traumatized orphan 6 years ago was leaving as the adopted daughter of one of the country's most influential figures. The same villagers who had looked down on her, ignored her suffering, or actively participated in her exploitation, now stared in disbelief at her miraculous change in fortune. As they walked back to the waiting cars, Sui Sui caught glimpses of faces she recognized. The shopkeeper who had always shortchanged her, the teachers who had looked the other way, the neighbors who had pretended not to hear when she cried at night. Their expressions were uniformly stunned, reassessing in real time the girl they had dismissed as worthless. The convoy pulled away from Qingshui village, leaving behind a cloud of dust and a community forever changed by what they had witnessed. Inside the lead car, Sui Sui sat in silence, watching the only world she had known for 6 years recede in the distance. While Sui Sui's physical liberation from her relatives was complete, a far more profound challenge awaited her, one that transcended the mere exchange of poverty for wealth. The car continued its journey toward the Lin estate, each kilometer widening the gap between the life she'd endured and the uncertain future that stretched before her. She pressed her fingertips against the cool window glass, watching the landscape transform from rural poverty to manicured affluence with a sense of unreality that made her wonder if this was merely an elaborate dream from which she would soon awaken. The first glimpse of the Lin family compound left Sui Sui momentarily breathless. The estate sprawled across the landscape like its own self-contained city, with the main residence rising from meticulously landscaped gardens. The central mansion alone dwarfed her entire village, its modern architecture of steel, glass, and stone speaking of wealth that existed beyond her capacity to comprehend. As the car passed through security gates taller than any building she had ever lived in, Sui Sui's hands instinctively clenched in her lap. How could a person raised in dirt-floor poverty possibly belong in such a place? "This is just the main residence," the driver explained, noticing her wide-eyed expression in the rearview mirror. "The family owns properties throughout the country and abroad, but Madame Lin prefers to conduct business from here." Staff members emerged as the car approached the entrance. More people than Sui Sui had interacted with in months. They moved with practiced efficiency, bowing respectfully as Madame Lin emerged from the vehicle. One young woman stepped forward specifically for Sui Sui, offering a gentle smile that stood out amidst the formal propriety of the others. "I'm Min," she said with a small bow. "Madame Lin has assigned me to assist with your transition. Please follow me." Sui Sui followed Min through the mansion's entrance hall, a space larger than the entire dwelling she had just left behind. Polished marble floors reflected the light from crystal chandeliers, suspended from ceilings that seemed impossibly high. Artwork that likely cost more than everything in Qingshui village decorated walls of pristine white, creating an atmosphere of rarefied elegance that made Sui Sui acutely aware of the dirt under her fingernails and the coarseness of her clothes. "Your suite has been prepared," Min explained, as they entered an elevator, another first for Sui Sui. "Madame Lin thought you might appreciate some time to rest before meeting the rest of the family." The word suite had little meaning to Sui Sui until the elevator doors opened directly into a living space larger than her uncle's entire house. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a panoramic view of the city below, while tasteful furniture in cream and pale blue created an atmosphere of serene luxury. Min led her through to a bedroom with a bed that could have comfortably fit 4 people, and beyond that, a bathroom with fixtures that might as well have been from another planet. "This is all for me?" Sui Sui asked, her voice barely audible. Min nodded. "Madame Lin wanted to ensure your comfort. The closet has been stocked with clothes that should fit you. There's a tablet on the nightstand programmed with information about the house and family. If you need anything at all, just press this button." She indicated a small panel on the wall. "Someone will attend to you immediately." Left alone, Sui Sui stood frozen in the center of the room, afraid to touch anything. The soft carpet beneath her feet seemed to mock the calluses she had developed from years of walking on dirt and stone. Her reflection in the mirror, a thin girl, with wary eyes and clothing that marked her as an outsider, appeared like a glaring error in this setting of pristine luxury. The bathroom presented technologies she had never encountered: a shower with multiple jets, a toilet with an electronic control panel, and faucets that activated without being touched. It took her 15 minutes of hesitant experimentation before she understood how to use the most basic functions. The hot water, when she finally managed to activate it correctly, brought tears to her eyes. Not just from the luxury of abundant warmth, but from the stark reminder of how much she had been denied. The morning brought Sui Sui's introduction to Madame Lin's 3 sons, each powerful CEOs in their own right within the vast Lin business empire. They arrived at the mansion specifically to meet their mother's unexpected adoptee, their reactions forming a spectrum that would define Sui Sui's early days in her new home. The eldest son, Lin Wei, made no attempt to mask his hostility. Tall and imposing in an impeccably tailored suit, he regarded Sui Sui with naked suspicion, his handshake perfunctory, and his questions pointed. "How convenient that you happened to be there when my mother needed medical assistance," he remarked, his voice carrying an undercurrent of accusation. "And how fortunate for you that she felt compelled to repay that debt so generously." The middle son, Lin Jian, approached the situation with clinical detachment. Where his older brother displayed open antagonism, Jian exhibited the cool assessment of a man calculating risks and potential damage control. "My mother's decision is uncharacteristically impulsive," he observed, while studying Sui Sui, as one might examine an unexpected variable in an equation. "However, what's done is done. The question now is how to integrate you with minimal disruption to family dynamics and business operations." It was only the youngest brother, Lin Chen, who showed any genuine warmth. Though still guarded, he made efforts to ease Sui Sui's obvious discomfort, redirecting conversation when his brother's questions became too aggressive and occasionally offering a reassuring smile. "You must feel overwhelmed," he acknowledged, when they had a moment apart from the others. "It's a lot to adjust to, even without my brother's interrogation. If you need anything, please don't hesitate to ask. Not everyone here sees you as an intruder." That first formal meeting set the tone for Sui Sui's early days in the mansion. She navigated a labyrinth of unfamiliar technologies: smart home systems that controlled lighting and temperature, entertainment systems with more options than she could comprehend, kitchen appliances that seemed designed for an alien species. Each day brought new challenges in learning the unspoken etiquette of wealth: which fork to use at formal dinners, how to address household staff, the appropriate attire for different occasions. Yet amidst this disorientation, Madame Lin created a protected space for Sui Sui to adjust. She assigned staff known for their patience and discretion to guide the girl through her transition. When Lin Wei suggested moving Sui Sui to a smaller property, more suited to her background, Madame Lin's refusal was immediate and firm. "She stays here, where I can ensure her well-being," she declared with finality. "This girl saved my life without expectation of reward. She has shown more integrity in her 16 years than many demonstrate in a lifetime. She will be afforded every opportunity and protection this family can provide." Within weeks, whispers about the village girl, adopted by the Lin family, began circulating through high society. Business associates and social connections speculated about Madame Lin's unusual decision, theories ranging from secret family connections to elaborate publicity stunts. For Sui Sui, insulated from most of this gossip by the mansion's walls, the focus remained on adapting to her new reality, one unfamiliar luxury at a time. The luxury surrounding Sui Sui served as mere window dressing to the profound metamorphosis unfolding within her. While she marveled at electronic devices and plush furnishings, Madame Lin had assembled a team of specialists tasked with a far more intricate challenge: reshaping a girl forged through hardship into someone who could navigate a world built on privilege without losing her essential self. "We begin today," Madame Lin announced one morning, leading Sui Sui into a previously unseen wing of the mansion. The room resembled a classroom, with maps adorning walls and shelves lined with books. "Your education is my highest priority." Sui Sui stared at the gleaming desk, her fingers trembling slightly as she touched its polished surface. 3 tutors awaited her, specialists in mathematics, literature, and sciences, their faces betraying no judgment, despite the obvious gaps in her knowledge. The first assessment revealed what Madame Lin had suspected. Beneath years of educational neglect lay an exceptionally sharp mind. Sui Sui could calculate complex sums in her head, a skill developed from years of market transactions where mistakes meant punishment, but struggled with formal mathematical notation. She could speak articulately, but had never learned proper writing techniques. "She thinks differently," the mathematics tutor reported to Madame Lin after the first week. "She solves problems through intuitive pathways rather than conventional methods. With proper cultivation, this could become her greatest strength." Each morning began with 4 hours of intensive study. Sui Sui attacked her lessons with the same determination she had once applied to hauling water buckets, often continuing well past scheduled endpoints. When her literature tutor discovered her reading by flashlight at 3 in the morning, Madame Lin didn't scold her, but instead arranged for better lighting in her suite, quietly acknowledging the hunger for knowledge that had been denied for so long. The physical transformation occurred simultaneously with her educational one. A team of healthcare professionals addressed years of neglect, treating vitamin deficiencies, strengthening a spine slightly curved from carrying heavy loads, and healing chronic infections she had simply learned to endure. The family's personal physician expressed astonishment at her resilience. "Most bodies would have permanently surrendered to these conditions," he confided to Madame Lin. "Her physical constitution is extraordinary." As proper nutrition replaced years of near starvation, Sui Sui's appearance underwent a striking metamorphosis. The sallow complexion gave way to clear skin with a natural glow. Her brittle hair, once dulled by malnutrition, grew thick and lustrous. The transformation wasn't manufactured through expensive treatments, but rather revealed the natural beauty that had been buried beneath deprivation. Perhaps the most challenging aspect of Sui Sui's transformation came not from academic or physical changes, but from psychological ones. The girl who had spent years serving others now struggled to accept being served. The first time a maid attempted to help her dress, Sui Sui instinctively grabbed the clothes and backed away, her face flushed with shame. "I can do it myself," she insisted, hands trembling. Madame Lin observed these moments carefully, recognizing deeper trauma beneath surface discomfort. "The boundaries between serving and being served have been weaponized against you," she explained gently one evening, as they shared tea. "In this house, service is given with respect, not extracted through fear." Several staff members noticed how Sui Sui would wake before dawn, making her bed with hospital corners and tidying her suite before anyone arrived. Rather than forcing her to stop, Madame Lin instructed them to simply accept these behaviors while gradually introducing the concept that her value didn't depend on her utility. Etiquette lessons proved particularly challenging. For Sui Sui, formal dining had once meant serving food she wasn't permitted to eat. Now she faced an arsenal of specialized cutlery and rigid social protocols. During her first practice dinner, she knocked over a water glass and immediately dropped to her knees to clean it, her body anticipating punishment. The etiquette instructor moved to reprimand her, but Madame Lin silenced him with a look, kneeling beside Sui Sui instead. "Accidents happen in every household," she said, helping blot the water. "The difference is how we respond to them." That simple act, the family matriarch kneeling on hardwood floors alongside her, shifted something fundamental in Sui Sui's understanding of worth and dignity. She began to comprehend that true refinement wasn't expressed through rigid rules, but through kindness, consistently applied, regardless of status. The household staff presented another dimension to Sui Sui's adaptation. These professionals, impeccably trained and discreet, maintained a complex relationship with the former village girl. They respected her position as Madame Lin's adopted daughter, yet recognized her background more intimately than the family ever could. Some developed protective instincts toward her, particularly those who had witnessed her initial arrival. Others maintained professional distance, uncertain how to categorize someone who had so recently occupied a position similar to their own. In this delicate negotiation of relationships, Sui Sui's natural empathy emerged as her greatest asset. She learned names quickly, remembered personal details, and acknowledged the dignity of work she understood intimately. When she found the elderly groundskeeper struggling with heavy equipment, she didn't hesitate to assist, ignoring the boundary between family member and staff that others might have zealously maintained. "Miss Sui Sui doesn't behave like other wealthy young ladies," the housekeeper remarked to Madame Lin. "She sees people others overlook." Most surprising throughout this transformation was Madame Lin herself. The business titan, known for ruthless efficiency and exacting standards, displayed unexpected patience with Sui Sui's development. Unlike her approach with her sons, whom she had driven relentlessly toward excellence, Madame Lin adopted a gentler methodology, understanding intuitively that Sui Sui had already experienced enough harshness to last several lifetimes. The two women developed evening rituals where they would review the day's lessons, Madame Lin offering guidance that went beyond social protocols to encompass wisdom earned through decades navigating a world that frequently underestimated her. These quiet conversations revealed dimensions of Madame Lin unknown even to her sons: her humor, her philosophical depth, her capacity for nurturing when circumstances warranted it. "I was not so different from you once," Madame Lin confided during one such evening, surprising Sui Sui. "Not in circumstance perhaps, but in determination. I recognized something in you on that roadside, something beyond simple kindness." As weeks became months, Sui Sui emerged not as a perfect replica of upper-class refinement, but as something more compelling, a young woman whose natural intelligence and compassion had been enhanced rather than erased by her new circumstances. She mastered the rules of her new world, while maintaining the core qualities that had sustained her through hardship. Her transformation became evident in subtle ways: the quiet confidence with which she now navigated social interactions, the thoughtful questions she posed during family discussions, her ability to move between worlds without surrendering her identity to either. She retained her capacity for hard work, but learned to direct it toward growth rather than mere survival. Her empathy, once a private resource she protected carefully, became a strength she deployed purposefully. Staff members who had initially viewed her with curiosity or skepticism gradually recognized something exceptional developing. She carries herself differently now, the security director noted. Not like someone pretending to belong, but like someone who knows exactly who she is. Beneath the security director's observation lay a truth far more profound than anyone could have imagined. The seemingly random encounter on that rural roadside hadn't been mere coincidence. It was the invisible hand of fate, reconnecting severed bloodlines. As Suisui flourished within the Lin household, something stirred in Madame Lin's memory, subtle echoes of the past, reflected in the young woman's features that couldn't be dismissed as coincidental. Madame Lin found herself studying Sui's face during their evening conversations, her gaze lingering on certain expressions that triggered fragments of recognition. It wasn't merely gratitude or affection driving her interest in the girl's background. It was an inexplicable sense of connection that transcended their brief acquaintance. One evening, after their customary discussion of the day's lessons, Madame Lin gently broached the subject of Sui's parents. "You've shared so little about them," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "I wonder sometimes about the people who raised such an extraordinary daughter." Sui's recollections were limited, fragmented memories of warmth and security rather than detailed portraits. Her understanding of their deaths had come primarily through her relatives' terse explanations, never questioned by a grieving child. As she spoke, Madame Lin noticed discrepancies in the timeline, inconsistencies in the narrative that might have seemed insignificant to anyone else. 23 people died in that landslide. Suisui repeated what she'd been told. "My parents among them." Madame Lin nodded thoughtfully. But later that night, she made a call to the head of her private security team. By morning, an investigation was underway. Discreet inquiries into a 6-year-old natural disaster in a remote village that would have seemed bizarre to anyone unaware of Madame Lin's growing suspicions. The preliminary report arrived within days, and what it contained left Madame Lin breathless. The landslide had indeed occurred, claiming lives and destroying homes. But the list of confirmed casualties contained no mention of anyone matching the descriptions Suisui had provided of her parents. More curious still, birth records from Qingshui village showed no Li Suisui born to any resident family during that period. "Deepen the investigation," Madame Lin instructed, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Find out everything about the woman who claimed to be Sui's mother." The discovery came 3 weeks later, in a manila folder placed discreetly on Madame Lin's desk. The investigator stood silently as she examined the contents. A personnel file from 20 years earlier, containing the employment record of a young woman named Ming Lian, who had worked in the Lin household as a domestic assistant. Attached was a faded photograph showing a pretty young woman with a gentle smile that struck Madame Lin with painful familiarity. "She left quite suddenly," the investigator explained. "According to employment records, she resigned without notice shortly after the Lunar New Year celebrations." Madame Lin remembered her now, a quiet, efficient girl who had worked primarily in the family quarters. What she couldn't recall was any particular interaction between the young woman and her sons. Yet something about the timing nagged at her consciousness. "What happened to her after she left our employment?" Madame Lin asked. "That's where it gets interesting, madam. She relocated to Qingshui village, where she married a local farmer named Li Jun. They lived there until their deaths in a vehicle accident, not a landslide, when their daughter was 10 years old." The room seemed to tilt slightly as Madame Lin processed this information. A vehicle accident, not a natural disaster. A deliberate fabrication designed to obscure a connection. But what connection precisely? That evening, Madame Lin found herself in a rarely visited storage room, pulling out family albums from 2 decades earlier. She paged through them methodically until she found photographs from the year Ming Lian had worked in their home. Family gatherings, business events, casual moments captured and preserved. In many, the household staff appeared in the background, Ming Lian among them. In one particular photograph, taken during the Lunar New Year celebration, Ming Lian stood slightly apart from the other staff. Her posture seemed different somehow, protective rather than formal. Madame Lin studied it under a magnifying glass, noting what might have been the slightest curve to the young woman's abdomen, carefully concealed by her traditional dress. "It can't be," she whispered to the empty room. Yet when she looked back over the recent photographs of Sui Sui and compared them with images of her youngest son at the same age, the similarities became impossible to ignore. The same distinctive arch of eyebrows, the identical way their eyes crinkled when they smiled genuinely, even certain gestures and expressions that seemed eerily familiar when displayed by the young woman. Lin Chen, her youngest son, had been barely 20 that year, recently returned from his first year at an American university, full of new ideas and rebellious energy. Had there been something between him and the quiet household employee, something significant enough to result in Ming Lian's abrupt departure? With trembling hands, Madame Lin reached for her phone. This wasn't a matter for investigators anymore. This required scientific certainty. "I need discrete DNA testing arranged," she told her most trusted assistant, "and I need absolute confidentiality." Obtaining Sui Sui's DNA proved simple enough. A brush with a few strands of hair was all that was required. Her son's sample came from a recent medical checkup, still on file. As Madame Lin waited for the results, she found herself in a state of emotional turmoil, unlike anything she'd experienced in decades of business dealings. If her suspicions proved correct, what would it mean? The girl she had come to love as a daughter might actually be her granddaughter, the product of a relationship deliberately hidden from her. The implications cascaded through her mind. Her son's right to know, Sui Sui's right to understand her true heritage, the questions of why Ming Lian had kept this secret and created an entirely new identity. When the results arrived, Madame Lin sat alone in her study for hours, the sealed envelope before her, gathering courage to confirm what her heart already knew. The clinical language of the report couldn't obscure the emotional weight of its conclusion, a 99.9% probability of paternal relationship between Lin Chen and Li Sui Sui. The truth hit her with physical force. Sui Sui wasn't simply an orphan girl who had saved her life. She was family, her blood, her legacy. The granddaughter she'd never known existed, and her presence in Madame Lin's life hadn't been random at all, but perhaps something more profound, a circle completing itself, despite all attempts to break it. In one stunning moment of clarity, Madame Lin understood why she had felt such an immediate connection to the girl on that roadside. It hadn't been mere gratitude or compassion that compelled her to bring Sui Sui into her home. It had been the unconscious recognition of her own bloodline. Some part of her had known, even before her conscious mind could articulate the possibility. Now came the truly difficult part. How could she reveal this truth without shattering the delicate new reality they had constructed? Her son had no idea he had fathered a child. Sui Sui had no reason to question the identity of her parents. The revelation would fundamentally alter their understanding of themselves and each other. What would you do if you discovered the orphan you rescued was actually your own flesh and blood? As Madame Lin clutched the DNA results that proved her suspicions, she faced an impossible choice: continue the comfortable fiction they'd all been living, or detonate a truth that would forever transform the relationship between her son and the young woman who had saved her life. The weight of this knowledge pressed against her chest as she contemplated its explosive potential. Some family secrets, when revealed, don't just change the past, they completely rewrite the future for everyone involved. After a restless night of deliberation, she summoned her youngest son to her private study, a room where family matters of the utmost importance had been settled for generations. Lin Chen arrived with his usual easy smile, unaware that his world was about to shift irreversibly. "Mother, you wanted to see me? You look serious? Is everything all right with your health?" His concern was genuine, his eyes carrying the same warmth that had drawn Sui Sui's mother to him 2 decades earlier. Madame Lin gestured to a chair across from her desk. "Please sit, Chen. What I'm about to share will be difficult to hear, She placed a folder before him, opening it to reveal photographs of a young woman alongside his own image from the same age. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same distinctive eyebrow arch, the same subtle dimple when they smiled. "Do you remember Ming Lian, who worked in our household 20 years ago?" His face transformed instantly, color draining as decades-old memories rushed forward. "Of course I remember her. We were, close." His voice faltered. "You sent her away. You said it was for the best." "I believed it was," Madame Lin replied softly, "but there was something you were never told." She slid the DNA results across the desk, watching her son's expression shift from confusion to disbelief to shock as understanding dawned. "This can't be," Lin Chen whispered, his fingers trembling as they traced the lines connecting his genetic markers to Sui Sui's. "Are you saying Sui Sui is your daughter?" Madame Lin confirmed. "Ming Lian was pregnant when she left our home." The revelation struck Lin Chen like a physical blow. He rose abruptly, pacing the study with agitated steps. "Why wasn't I told? Why would Ming keep this from me? We loved each other." "Class differences made your relationship impossible in the eyes of society," Madame Lin explained. "The board was pressuring me about succession plans. Your brothers were already being groomed for leadership." She paused, her voice heavy with regret. "I told Ming Lian that pursuing a relationship with you would destroy your future with the company. I arranged for her relocation and financial support, not knowing she was carrying your child." Lin Chen stopped at the window, his back to his mother. "She never told me she was pregnant. She just disappeared. I was told she had accepted a better position elsewhere." His voice broke. All these years my daughter was suffering while I lived in luxury." The family meeting that followed was a seismic event in the Lin household. Gathered in the formal dining room, Madame Lin methodically presented the evidence to all three sons. Lin Wei, the eldest, received the news with characteristic suspicion, immediately questioning the reliability of the tests and potential motives. Lin Jian, ever analytical, accepted the scientific evidence, but immediately began calculating the implications for the family business and public perception. "This changes nothing about company operations," Lin Jian stated firmly, "but we must consider how this information impacts succession planning and public relations. There will be questions about why she was living in poverty if she's a Lin." Lin Wei's response was more pointed. "How convenient that she happens to be related to us after mother brings her into our home. Are we certain this isn't some elaborate scheme?" Lin Chen, usually the peacemaker, slammed his hand on the table with unexpected force. "Enough! This isn't about the company or some imagined conspiracy. This is about a young woman, my daughter, who has suffered needlessly while we've enjoyed every privilege." His voice quivered with emotion. "Can you even comprehend what she's been through? What she's endured while I remained oblivious to her existence?" The revelation to Sui Sui herself came later that evening. Madame Lin requested her presence in the garden pavilion, a space designed for contemplation and private conversation. When Sui Sui arrived, she found not only Madame Lin, but also Lin Chen, waiting with solemn expressions. "Have I done something wrong?" Sui Sui asked, her old instincts surfacing despite months in her new environment. "No, child," Madame Lin said gently. "Please sit. We have something important to tell you." She took Sui Sui's hands in hers. "When I was investigating your background, I discovered something unexpected, something that explains why I felt such an immediate connection to you that day on the roadside." As Madame Lin carefully explained the DNA results and the history that had been hidden from both Lin Chen and Sui Sui, the young woman sat in stunned silence. The revelation that the man sitting across from her, the kind brother who had been most welcoming since her arrival, was actually her biological father shattered all her assumptions about her identity and place in the world. "My mother worked here," Sui Sui finally whispered. "And you?" She turned to Lin Chen, unable to complete the sentence. Lin Chen moved to kneel before her, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I didn't know. If I had known about you, I would have moved heaven and earth to find you. Please believe that." Sui Sui's response surprised them both. "The woman I called mother in the village She looked nothing like me. I always wondered why. A single tear tracked down her cheek. Sometimes I would catch my reflection and wonder where my features came from. And now, she looked at Lin Chen with new awareness, seeing the undeniable similarities between them. The days that followed were filled with awkward attempts at connection. Lin Chen, overcome with guilt for years of unintentional abandonment, alternated between keeping a respectful distance and overwhelming Sui Sui with attention and gifts. Sui Sui, for her part, struggled to reconcile the father she'd never known with the man she'd come to know as a supportive family member. "I don't know how to be a father," Lin Chen confessed during a halting conversation in the estate's library. "I've missed 16 years of your life, and I don't know how to be a daughter," Sui Sui replied with unexpected wisdom. "Perhaps we can just be who we are to each other now and let the rest develop naturally." Gradually, they began to discover connections beyond physical resemblance. Lin Chen's passion for architecture was mirrored in Sui Sui's fascination with structures and spaces. His analytical mind that could solve complex problems found its echo in her ability to see solutions where others saw only obstacles. Even their mannerisms, the way they both tilted their heads slightly when considering a complex question, created moments of recognition that built bridges across the years of separation. The bonds forming between Sui Sui and her biological father strengthened daily, but the past rarely stays buried when fortune changes hands. News travels quickly through business circles, and some ghosts from the past don't stay buried, especially those who suddenly see profit in claiming they always knew you were destined for greatness. Word of Sui Sui's true lineage spread through whispered conversations at corporate events and executive lunches. The revelation that the orphan from Qingshui village was actually the daughter of Lin Chen, heir to one of the country's largest business empires, traveled from the gleaming skyscrapers of the city to the dusty roads of her former village like an unstoppable wave. When the information reached her uncle and aunt, their reaction was immediate and predictable. The same people who had worked her to exhaustion and attempted to sell her to the highest bidder suddenly developed selective amnesia about their treatment of her. Within days, they had constructed an entirely new narrative, one where they had always recognized her special qualities and had devoted themselves to nurturing her potential, despite their limited means. 3 weeks after the DNA results confirmed her parentage, Sui Sui was reviewing architectural plans with her father when the household manager announced unexpected visitors from Qingshui village. She felt her body tense instinctively before taking a deep breath. Lin Chen placed a protective hand on her shoulder, a silent question in his eyes. She nodded, knowing this confrontation was inevitable. "Let them wait 15 minutes, she instructed the manager, with a calmness that surprised even herself. "Then show them to the garden pavilion." When Sui Sui finally entered the pavilion, she was a vision of composed elegance. Gone was the hunched posture and downcast eyes of the girl who once flinched at sudden movements. In their place stood a young woman whose quiet confidence radiated from every deliberate step. Her uncle and aunt rose awkwardly from their seats, clutching elaborately wrapped packages. Their eyes darted nervously around the pavilion, which was larger than their entire home. "Sui Sui," her aunt exclaimed with forced warmth, "look how beautiful you've become. We always knew you were special. Remember how I used to call you my clever girl?" Her uncle nodded vigorously. "The whole village talked about how smart you were. We always said you were meant for greater things." Sui Sui observed them with detached curiosity, noting their new clothes, clearly purchased for this visit, and the way they stumbled over formalities they'd never bothered to learn before. She accepted their gifts without opening them, and listened as they spun elaborate tales of how they had protected and nurtured her after her parents' death. "We did everything we could with what little we had," her aunt insisted, reaching for Sui's hand. "We always made sure you had food before we ate." Sui Sui gently withdrew her hand. "Did you?" she asked softly. "Is that why I learned to survive on rice and vegetable scraps while you and my cousins ate meat?" Her uncle's expression hardened before quickly rearranging itself into a smile. "You misremember, child. Times were difficult for all of us. Were they difficult when you received the first payment from the Zhang family?" Sui Sui asked, her voice steady. Or when you bought new furniture the same month you told me school supplies were too expensive. As if on cue, Madame Lin and Lin Chen entered the pavilion. Her relatives' expressions transformed instantly into deferential smiles. They bowed repeatedly, showering praise on the Lin family and emphasizing their close connection to Sui Sui. "We raised her as our own daughter," her uncle declared. "We always saw greatness in her." Lin Chen's expression remained impassive. "Is that why you arranged to sell her to a man known for mistreating his previous young brides?" The color drained from her uncle's face. "There has been a misunderstanding. We were only trying to secure her future." Madame Lin signaled to an assistant who brought forward a thick folder. "We've interviewed 27 residents of Qingshui village about Sui Sui's treatment in your home." Her voice was cool and precise. "We have signed statements describing how she worked from dawn until night, with inadequate food and clothing. We have documentation of the bride price negotiation with the Zhang family, including the deposit you received." Her relatives sat in stunned silence as Madame Lin continued. "We also have financial records showing the support payments that were sent to you monthly for Sui Sui's care. Payments you clearly never used for her benefit." "Support payments?" Sui Sui asked, turning to Madame Lin with genuine surprise. "When your mother left our household, arrangements were made for her financial support," Madame Lin explained gently. "Those payments continued after her death and were redirected to your relatives for your care." Sui Sui's aunt began to sob theatrically. "We never received any payments. We struggled to provide for her. The bank records indicate otherwise," Lin Chen stated flatly. "The transfers were accepted, and the funds withdrawn each month for 6 years." Her uncle's demeanor shifted suddenly from ingratiating to defensive. "We took her in when no one wanted her. We fed her, clothed her. What more could you expect from simple village people? Not everyone can live like royalty." Sui Sui studied the man who had dominated her childhood with fear and intimidation. Now he seemed smaller somehow, diminished by his own transparent greed. "I never expected to live like royalty," she said, quietly. "I only wanted to be treated with basic human dignity." Her uncle's expression darkened. "You ungrateful," he caught himself, glancing nervously at the Lin family. "You misunderstood our intentions. We were preparing you for the realities of life. By selling me to a man 3 times my age?" Sui Sui asked. Her relatives exchanged panicked looks as they realized their carefully constructed narrative was collapsing. "We can explain," her aunt began, but fell silent when Sui Sui raised her hand. "There's nothing to explain," Sui Sui said. "I lived through it all. I remember everything." For a moment, the pavilion was silent, except for the sound of a gentle fountain in the background. Her aunt and uncle seemed to shrink further into their seats as they realized their victim now held all the power. "Are you going to have us arrested?" her uncle finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sui Sui considered the question carefully. Part of her wanted them to suffer as she had suffered, to know the helplessness and fear that had been her constant companions. But another part recognized that continuing the cycle of harm would only bind her more tightly to her painful past. "Criminal charges will be filed for the financial fraud and child endangerment," Lin Chen stated matter-of-factly. "The courts will determine appropriate punishment." Sui Sui nodded in agreement. "But I won't be pursuing personal vengeance. Instead, I've established a foundation that will identify and support orphaned children in rural villages, ensuring they receive proper care, education, and protection from exploitation. Your village will be our first focus area." Her uncle's face contorted with rage, but her aunt placed a restraining hand on his arm. They both understood that their social standing in the village would be destroyed when the Foundation's representatives arrived and revealed the truth of their actions. As her relatives were escorted from the estate, Sui Sui felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. She had faced her abusers without flinching and had chosen a path that would help others rather than simply punishing those who had hurt her. "Are you all right?" Lin Chen asked quietly when they were alone. Sui Sui nodded. "I think I am. For the first time, I saw them clearly, not as the all-powerful figures from my childhood, but as small, selfish people who chose cruelty when kindness would have cost them nothing." The boardroom fell silent as Sui Sui concluded her presentation. Mr. Wen Ruhai, Bodley's CEO, nodded with approval. Her innovative approach had secured the partnership. The journey from exploitation to executive had been arduous, but her appointment as manager at Lin's Corporation validated her resilience. "Your perspective is uniquely valuable," Mr. Lin Chen said proudly, watching his daughter command the room with quiet confidence. What truly fulfilled Sui Sui wasn't the prestigious position or material comfort, but seeing her foundation's first orphanage open in Qingshui village. Those children would never experience what she had endured. True power, she discovered, resided not in privilege, but in preserving one's humanity through suffering.